What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Today we'll be going over 5 running backs to trade for or away this week, although typically we focus more on running backs to trade for, since figuring out who to trade away is much more team specific, both for you and for the person you're trading with. But we'll go over at least one player each week that I'm at least mildly concerned with. And let's be honest, we'll need to go over Joe Mixon again because he's the worst. Also, won't be including Antonio Gibson this week. We've mentioned him now twice in weeks 1 and in weeks 2 as the player you need to be targeting. Had him as the top running back target on the website, but he has scored in back-to-back weeks now. So while the takeover hasn't happened yet, we've been talking about how I really think he's going to be the feature back at some point this season. That hasn't happened yet, but he scored in back-to-back weeks and he plays Baltimore this next week. So I don't think right now is the time to trade for him. I still really want to have already done that, or will be looking to do so maybe if he has a bad game next week. But right now, I think we hold off on trading for Antonio Gibson because, again, 2 touchdowns back-to-back weeks, playing Baltimore next week, probably not the time to trade for him. So with that, we will start things off with the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was through 3 weeks, which quarterback leads the league in completed air yards? The answer is Matt Ryan. And Fernando Leyva was the first to get that one right. Today's stat, through 3 weeks, what defense has allowed the most fantasy points to the tight end position? All right, we will start off our buy lows this week with David Johnson. We talked last week about how you should be starting trade talks with David Johnson owners, but that you should be planning on finalizing those trades this week since he was unlikely to have a good game on Sunday. Well, unfortunately, he did score a touchdown, but he still only managed 11 carries for 23 yards and then 2 receptions for another 23 yards. That makes back-to-back games with less than 35 rushing yards, and he still only scored, 11.6 fantasy points, even with the touchdown, so it wasn't that great of a game. But like we talked about, he was playing the Ravens and the Steelers these last 2 weeks, and we expected the Texans to lose both games, so he was an underdog running back going up against 2 top 5 defenses. Of course he was going to underperform, but who are his next 4 opponents? The Vikings, Jaguars, Titans, and Packers. All 4 of those rank inside the top 12 in fantasy points allowed to running backs, and all are games the Texans can win. Maybe not the Packers game. They're definitely going to be underdogs in that game. They could win. But I think they'll be very competitive against the Vikings, the Jaguars, and the Titans. And that's going to benefit David Johnson. So I think these are all plus matchups for him. I think that given, he's actually performing relatively well. You look at the box scores and you're like, but he's putting up running back 2 numbers in these absolutely brutal matchups. I mean, you see the Texans, you're the Texans right now. You started off the season Chiefs, Ravens, Steelers. That is absolutely brutal. Those are probably the 3 most difficult games they're going to have all season. And so it's not shocking, like I said, that he hasn't performed amazingly. But he's still been able to put up running back 2 numbers because of the volume he's been receiving. And those are the types of players I want to target. Guys who have been doing fine in really, really difficult matchups. Next up, we have David Montgomery. And Montgomery's been pretty mediocre in fantasy so far this season. But he does have touch counts of 16, 19, and 17 so far, including exactly 3 targets each week, which isn't great, but that is an area we expect to expand moving forward since Tariq Cohen did suffer a major knee injury on Sunday. As of recording this, I'm not 100% sure that it was a torn ACL, but typically when teams say we fear it was a torn ACL, they're usually right. They don't usually come out with that information when they're not sure. So they have a pretty clear indication it's a torn ACL, but regardless, it was a bad knee injury. And when you remove Cohen, yes, he's only getting 3 targets per week as well, but if you can add a few of those, even just 2 of them to Montgomery, that's huge if he can get in that 4 or 5 target range each week. But his absence is just going to increase both the floor and the ceiling of Montgomery because we see Cohen playing roughly a third of snaps. And so that's keeping Montgomery around that 55% range. So if he can approach closer to 70% of snaps, because remember, he's not going to come in and just be the 100% featured back now, getting all of the carries, all of the targets. Like, they're still going to bring other running backs more into the mix. But if he can be, a 19, 20 touch running back every single week, regardless of game script moving forward, that's huge. And now we see Foles finally take over. I don't know why they went so long with Trubisky, but finally Foles is the quarterback now. And so maybe this offense can have a little bit more life, more scoring opportunities, more potential for positive game scripts. Plus, he's only coming off 6.4 fantasy points. So I know his owner is going to understand, it's pretty clear, right? Cohen gets hurt, Montgomery's upside gets higher. Everyone knows that. You're not being sneaky by trading for Montgomery. But he's not coming off a great game. Like I said, he hasn't been that amazing. And so I think his value is fair. You're not just dominating a trade when you get Montgomery, but I think we can feel really good about him. And like the running back I'm going to talk about in a second, these aren't players who it's like, oh my goodness, how could they be valued this low? I think Montgomery's value is extremely fair right now. And so if you need a running back, I think he's a great one to go after because I can value him as roughly a mid to high end running back too moving forward, especially if we get confirmation that Cohen is done for the season. There's no one that's going to take touches, and he's going to be a very safe running back who does have a higher ceiling now that Foles is the quarterback. So I think he's a great player to target in trades if you need a running back. And the third running back, like I just mentioned, someone that isn't necessarily just severely undervalued, but he's someone that if you're in the market for a running back one, and you know that you're not going to get Derrick Henry, you're not going to get Alvin Kamara, no one's trading you Zeke. Like, there are just guys that are running back ones who they're not on the trade block. There's nothing you can give up to get them. But I think for Josh Jacobs, he is someone you could possibly trade for. We did see his touches dip below 20 for the first time this season, and he failed to score a touchdown for the second consecutive week, meaning he's now scored 12 and 9.8 fantasy points over the last 2 weeks. But I'm not at all concerned about Jacobs. He's seen touch counts of 29, 30, and then 19, which is elite volume. And his 13 targets ranks 12th among all running backs. That's not something we're used to seeing. And it's honestly awesome that he's seeing this sort of receiving volume because we looked at last year, they talked about it. There was a lot of talk about getting him the ball in the receiving game, and they never did it. And we heard the talk again this summer, and we're like, okay, but are you going to actually throw him the ball when you're in clear passing situations? And the answer is sort of. He's not like a clear 100% of downs, coming on every third down back. But you know what? Ranking 12th among all running backs, you're taking that because he's going to be amongst the leaders in carries. So as long as he's getting some sort of work every week in the receiving game, we will take it. And the fact that he got 19 touches in a pretty bad loss in New England is very encouraging. Last season, he only reached 19 touches in 2 of their 7 losses. And of course, they lost more than 7 games, but the 7 losses where he was active. Because remember, he missed, I believe it was 2 or 3 weeks with the injury. So yes, he's still game script dependent for his upside, meaning that he's not going to hit his ceiling in games where they fall behind. He can in games where they lose, but games where, like this last week, they were behind pretty much the entire game, if not the entire game. And so that's not a game where you expect him to hit his ceiling. But his floor isn't quite as low as it was last season because they are still using him when they do fall behind. I have him ranked as the running back 9 in my rest of season rankings, which you can see at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But again, it's the same thing with David Montgomery. It's not that I view him, as a top 5 running back and everyone else has him as running back too, so you're getting this incredible value, right? Everyone knows Josh Jacobs is a good running back. But after these 2 kind of mediocre weeks, after seeing his touches drop in this past week, maybe people aren't feeling as confident in him as a running back 1. And I think he pretty clearly is a low-end running back 1. And even if you have to give up that sort of value to get him, you know what? If you need a running back, maybe you're 1 and 2, you're looking at your wide receivers and you're like, I'm awesome. Like, I have incredible receivers, but I'm just really lacking for that stud running back. Listen, you're not going to get Alvin Kamara. These guys that I talked about, Ezekiel Elliott, Derrick Henry, you're just not going to get them in a trade. And so if you're looking for running back 1, this is a guy I think someone will actually listen to trade offers to give you. And I think those are the players you should be going after, not Alvin Kamara. No one's giving him to you. Next up, we will go over our sell high candidate for the week, and it's Todd Gurley. Now, Gurley has seen 7 targets on the season, and he's turned that into 3 yards. That wasn't a mistake. 7 targets on the entire year through 3 weeks, 3 total yards from that. Luckily for his owners, he scored twice, including 80 rushing yards and a touchdown this week. However, he's only playing like half the snaps, and he has 0 involvement in the receiving game. That's very alarming, especially given how much they used Freeman last year. We thought, okay, Freeman wasn't great last year, but they gave him the ball a ton in the receiving game. Maybe they'll do the same to Gurley. Absolutely not. They're just not involving him at all. And despite being 0-3, they've actually had relatively positive game scripts for Gurley in these last 2 weeks. Like, these have been games where you thought maybe he hits his ceiling, right? I mean, he was in a shootout against Dallas, a pretty high scoring game against the Bears. And for both of those games, they had massive leads. So you'd think, right? This is the game. This is the spot where Gurley goes off. And he did fine last week, but these last 2 weeks, it's been like, he had 21 carries for 61 yards in week 2 with like no targets in a game that hit, what was the total? At 79? A game that hit 79 where they were leading by 17 points, 20 points in the first quarter, and he has 21 carries for 61 yards. And then a game against the Bears where they've got another massive lead. He has 80 and a touchdown, but you just think that he's going to hit such a higher ceiling in these games than he did. It just doesn't bode well, because if he doesn't have that sort of ceiling, and we know that they're not using the receiving game, so when they fall behind, they're not really throwing him the ball, I don't see the upside. And because I don't see the upside, I see a very low floor, and I see a lot of risk, because going into the year, he was one of the higher injury risks. We don't know when his knees are going to start to fall apart. I don't feel comfortable with it. And given that he has scored twice, he's coming off a pretty solid week, I think now's the time to sell. So if you've got Gurley, you can get running back 2 value for him. I think you take it because of the name value and the fact that he is producing right now. It's not great. It's like low-end running back 2 numbers, but at least he's coming off a solid game. I think now's the time to get rid of him. Final running back we have to go over, of course, is everyone's favorite, Joe Mixon. I'd really like to just not talk about him anymore. So if you're watching this, Joe, maybe play a little better this next week. I don't know. But anyways, he's been so bad, right? And the blame shouldn't be solely on him, but the blame needs to a large part be on him. But I just think it's everyone, right? He's been very, very bad with the opportunities he's been given, but they have also had 3 brutal matchups, and their insistence on using Bernard is a little bit confusing. The Bengals have faced the Chargers, the Browns, the Eagles so far, all of which rank in the top 10 in fewest fantasy points allowed to running backs. We know a few of those teams are more pass funnels, and the Bengals have lost or tied each week, which, as we talk about a bunch on this channel, is not good for running backs, except for maybe like Austin Eckler likes to go off when they lose. But last week we went over how Mixon can be both a buy and a sell, just depending on your situation, right? We talked about how if your team is like 2-0, again, last week, if your team was 2-0 and you had a bunch of players on your bench and you could afford to just trade for Mixon, throw him on the bench, see what happens, I think he's a great buy low. But there was also the other side where it was like, if you need a change to your team, you're 0-2 and Mixon still has a lot of name value, maybe you trade him away. So it depended a lot on your situation last week. You likely took, or the people in your league likely took him at the turn of like that first and the second round. So In no way is he like the only reason you might be losing, but it's possible he has like the biggest role into why many teams have had such a slow start. And talking with a few Mixon owners this weekend, I can tell you that it'll cost you a bag of potato chips to get him. Like, that is not an exaggeration. People are willing to give him away for nothing. So the question is, what do you do this week? Like, maybe after 2 weeks, he puts it together, and the third week he goes off. But we have a running back averaging 20 touches per week with 87.5% of the running back carries in the red zone and has no one behind him that's realistically going to take a lot of the work. Bernard is not going to see an expanded role from what we're seeing right now. This is it. Mixon's getting the touches. So given that he can't even outscore Kalen Ballage in fantasy, it's like, okay, he's getting all these touches, but do we even want him? I think if you don't own him, you basically have to at least send an offer, right? Send something low. Send something where you're like, you know what? If they accept this, how could I possibly be upset? Something on your bench, maybe your flex play, something to where you're not like, oh no, I actually didn't want them to accept that, right? You know, if we think back to last season, he was the running back 32 through week 8, averaging 8.8 points per game, and then he was the running back 5 from week 9 on. So we know he's an extremely talented player. We know he is capable of these huge monster games, and we know he can be a running back 1. But I'm not kidding. The people who own Mixon are done. They don't want him on their team anymore. So I'm not saying you return their draft value and give them a running back 1. No one should be doing that. You know, I'm just saying he's getting 20 touches. This is a team that we do expect midway through and to close the season to be better on offense. We expect he's going to continue to see some sort of involvement in the receiving game. He's going to keep this job in the red zone. So will he be a running back 1 to close the season? Probably not. Rest of the season, I don't think I have him ranked as running back 1. I think he's like the running back 14 or 15. But it is not going to cost you anything. And I think if we played this season out a million times, it benefits your team in trading for him right now more often than not. It might only be like 60% of the time. But I think the best move on like an average play perspective is to trade for him right now because it's not going to cost you anything. Now, the other side is a little bit more difficult. No one's jumping up and down to trade for Mixon right now just because he's been bad. So no one's going to offer you anything good, which for me makes him a buy and a hold. Buy if you don't have him because, like I said, the price is just incredibly low. But if you have him, I don't think you can trade him. You can bench him. That's absolutely fine. And you know what? Maybe you should. Maybe just throw him on the bench until you see something else change, especially if you were playing the flex. You know what? Just throw a wide receiver in that spot anyways. But no one is going to offer you enough for it to be worth giving him away because that's what you would have to do. You'd have to basically just give him away for almost nothing. And I don't think that's the best play that you have. I think that the best play, if you have him, is put him on the bench, see if the situation changes, because it's just not worth it, right? Is it really beneficial to your team to trade away Mixon, to take someone's flex play, to be like, well, you know what, this guy's actually not even that great either, and maybe he doesn't have that much upside, and it's probably a player who hasn't been going off because no one's, again, trading anything for Joe Mixon. I don't think that's the best play. I really think if you've got Mixon, you hold on to him. If someone is, for some reason, willing to give you like running back 2 value for him, well, okay, maybe we consider that because he has been terrible. But I think the play is you hold him if you have him, and you trade for him if you don't have him, just making sure you're not giving up too much. So, those are my thoughts on 5 different running backs this week. I post a much larger list of players to trade for on the website. So if you want more options for players to trade for and away, along with value you should be expecting to give up, then you can check that out at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But that's the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting that like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? Thanks for watching.